big sporting contest. He's been asked to take part and go early on because they're from that nation. And I'm hoping by the end of my presentation, we're more like Seb Coe after the 2012 Olympic Games than the England rugby team on the recent World Cup. I've chosen to call the presentation this morning Ozymandias shattering the visage of English curriculum design. And I think partly that was the influence of that underdog spirit making me give David a title that was either so pretentious that you might be coming along to be intrigued, or so befuddling that at least at the end you can't complain that it wasn't what you're expecting. So unless you come to the talk because all of the other presentations are full, I think we should all be on to a winner by the end. So now I want to begin by sharing with you a little bit of a confession. I used to be the Swindon consultant for the National Strategies for Literacy in Swindon. And as part of that lead up to that point, when I began my career in my PGC at Warwick University, a lot of the course was built around national strategy materials. And in the first and second year of my career as a teacher, we had national strategy advisors working with us. And then moving down to Wiltshire as head of English, we still had lots of national strategies consultants working with us in our team to help us, to support us. And what's quite exciting about today is this is a grassroots programme, and people are coming from all around the country to talk about English. So when I got the job as consultant, it almost felt like I had a job because I built a career around peddling the materials that other people had created. So as part of my confession, I was guilty of all of these things. I was guilty of telling people they had to do more group work, that discovery learning was really important, that teachers needed to talk less rather than talk better and give better explanations and better modelling in class, that we had to use heavy scaffolding of writing frames that we keep again and again and again, that short extracts were better than focusing on long texts and making sure students had the experience of studying whole novels, whole plays, anthologies of poems, that we should use massive assessment grids as part of assessing pupil progress. There were hundreds of different objectives in English and students had to learn every single one of those from year 1 all the way through to year 11, and that we would use progression maps to help us to make sure that students were making linear progress all the way through their learning. And that confession, that thinking about what I was advising other people to do, led me to the point of thinking about Ozymandias as a poem. I want to play you a recording of that poem now, just to re-familiarise yourselves with it if you're not familiar or if you've forgotten it.
And so, 2 vast and trunkless lakes of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shuttered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions mad which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that watched them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, you mighty and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, alone in level sands, stretch far away.
So, in Shelley's poem, what he's mocking are those pretensions of grandeur, the longevity of power and whether that can be decayed over time from the battering winds. And all that's left at the end of the poem is that colossal wreck. And as a consultant, reflecting back, now I wonder whether I was the equivalent of that slave to Ozymandias, listening to other people and doing what they told me to. And I hope that by the end of this morning's presentation, while I've convinced you that I'm a little bit more humble now, because what I want you to take you on is the journey of learning that we've been on at this school in terms of our overall curriculum design, but specifically the curriculum design in English. Now, towards the end of my time as a consultant, I began to listen to other voices. I began to hear the voice of the traveller from the antique land coming to tell me that what I'd been doing was far more fragile than I thought and far more susceptible to decay than I thought. So, as Ruth said earlier, as an SLT here, we began to read blogs, listen to people on Twitter, read far more in terms of educational publications. And at the same time, I joined Swindon Academy, at that time as head of sixth form. I met Ruth, but I also began to work with the students, the types of students that you've seen this morning here, but at that time they were very different. So I'd like to introduce you now to 3 anonymised students who used to be here at Swindon Academy. The first of those is Ellie. Now, I met Ellie, or a number of students like Ellie, when I began teaching in the sixth form here. She made masses of progress in her time at sixth form. There was a huge transformation in the quality of her essay writing because she began to understand some of the threshold concepts, to grapple with some of the threshold concepts in English. She was really confused at that time about some linguistic and literary terminology, and because of those things, she didn't believe that she could succeed in English, and she didn't believe, in particular, that she could memorise some of the quotations that needed to be on her head in closed text examinations to succeed in English literature, and she didn't believe she could memorise or relearn some of the literary terminology that she needed to be successful in English literary study. When she came out of the examination for English literature, she was really, really pleased, and I was pleased too, that she'd managed to put together about 12 pages of essay writing where she'd used the texts, that she'd used the quotations that she'd memorised, and she'd utilised literary terminology. But I couldn't help thinking at that point, at the end of my first year here, when I taught her for about 3 months, that actually it would have been a hell of a lot better if she'd begun that process in year 7. The second student I want to introduce you to is Sam. Now, Sam had a number of tragic events that happened during the course of his Key Stage 4, a lot like a lot of our other students who we teach, a lot of your students, I'd imagine. And that had an impact on his attendance, and therefore on his learning, but I don't think that had the most significant impact on his learning. Actually, Sam's ability to be the master of oblique questioning had the biggest impact on his skills in the classroom. If we were studying Ozymandias in class, Sam would try to find every opportunity to ask his teacher about the last night's episode of Breaking Bad, or what their favourite type of biscuit was, and that meant that he was the master of opting out. And so in terms of our teaching model here, we've worked on ways to ensure that students can opt out less of their learning, both through the B4L system, Behaviour for Learning system that Ruth mentioned earlier, but also through the Teach Like a Champion strategies that we've introduced during the time Ruth and I have been working here. Will's the last student I want you to introduce you to. Will's very different to the other two. Historically, he hadn't performed as well as the other students I've mentioned, and as well as his other peers. But he was far more driven, far more motivated than them. So you'd give him a list of wider reading, and he'd go off and read that, but then he'd find more reading to do in his own time. He'd also, because of that reading, be able to ask more challenging questions and engage other students in the lesson in a way that they couldn't have done if he hadn't have been there. He ate books, he'd read everything. Oops. That's not meant to happen. There we go. Okay, and because of all those things, he thought really deeply about subject content, not just in English, but across the curriculum. And because he wasn't just doing that in English, he'd be able to bring the knowledge and understanding he had from other subject areas into his study of literature. But Will needed far more in terms of wider opportunities. Will got to a really good university. He's currently studying at Durham, but he wanted to apply for Cambridge, and he realised quite early on that he wouldn't be able to make it to Cambridge because he didn't have the depth of wider experiences to include in his personal statement, the depth of wider reading that he should have done between year 7 or even before that and year 11 to prepare him for sixth form. So, since those early days, in order to avoid students like Sam opting out, and in order to avoid students like Ellie not being prepared for their sixth form study and going on to university, and in order to prepare students like Will for that potential Oxbridge place, we've begun to listen to people like Daniel Willingham, and his work on memory. And we've begun to work alongside people like Bruno Reddy from King Solomon Academy, who we drew the maths mastery learning from, and Sean Allison from Durrington School in Sussex, whose teaching model we've drawn on, and Doug Lemoff's work on Teach Like a Champion. We've drawn on their learning in order to develop our own model of curriculum, and our own model of teaching and learning that I imagine is fairly similar to some of the models that you've got in place in your schools. But I want to talk you through our thinking in terms of that. We've also thought about Daisy Christodou's work on assessment, and also Martin Robinson's work on the trivium, and their work has helped us to think about what we do here in a very different way. And that's led to this, which you may see around school in various different places. This is our codified model of curriculum design and teaching. And where you'll get to see the whole of this, I'm going to talk you through parts of this in the rest of the presentation. Alongside our pragmatic attitude and our desire to do the best for our students, though, we were aware that the Year 7 and 8 cohort that were coming through in our first year here were also going to be the cohort who this year had begun that linear approach to English with terminal examinations, and we wanted to make sure that those students were ready to sit a terminal exam at the end of Year 11 that would be the culmination of all of their learning from Year Dot through to Year 11. And in order for them to be successful, the first port of call was making sure that they had the core knowledge that they needed to be able to do those examinations. They needed that terminology. They needed to be able to use grammar correctly or effectively in standard English, both in speech and in writing. And that, we realised, needed to be stored in their long-term memory. So in the same way Bruno Reddy at King Solomon have been doing work on times tables, we realised that we needed to focus far more than we had been on explicit grammar teaching. And then building on top of that, the application of that grammar work in all kinds of subject contexts. So during the rest of the presentation, there are a number of things I want to talk you through. I want to talk you through what we actually mean by mastery here, because mastery is a term that gets flung around a lot in education. I think it's important that we establish what that means here. I want to talk about some of the conflicts between mastery and the threshold concept, and also the theories behind memory and retention of knowledge and forgetting. I want to talk about the process that we use based on those principles to define our English curriculum with David Didow. And then finally, hopefully in a far more honest and humble way than I've done in the past, I'd like to give you an opportunity to challenge me on some of the things I've talked about, and question and probe and help me in terms of my thinking. So to begin with, what is mastery? So for us, because it's become so commonplace, we needed a way to define it for all of our teachers. And there are 4 essential strands of our mastery curriculum, which I'll show you in a moment. But mastery for me contrasts with what might have been called a spiral curriculum in the past, because once an element of English has been mastered, you don't go back and reteach that unless a gap has emerged or a student's forgotten. So our 4 key principles of our mastery curriculum are these. Now, with a spiral curriculum, with a spiral curriculum, you would block your learning into chunks, and you might start from the chunk of a term. A lot of schools chunk their modules over 6 weeks simply because that's the chunk of time that we use as a term. And we wanted to avoid that with our mastery curriculum, because that's not what a mastery curriculum is about. For us, a mastery curriculum is about defining the core knowledge and threshold concepts based on the knowledge that you know the student needs to have achieved by a certain point in time. And for us, for all of us, really, that's either their A-levels or their GCSEs. If you're at university level, that's going to be their final exams or their end-of-year exams. And then that defines how long that module is, rather than your term. So rather than saying, we have our term, let's fill it with all this, you say, we have all of this knowledge that our students need, we have this level of understanding they need to achieve, and this is the amount of time that we need, on average, when we set our high expectations for our students to achieve it. The second core principle is about teachers' beliefs. And the teachers believe that the overwhelming majority of those students, virtually all students, can achieve that level of knowledge and that level of understanding and be able to do the things that you want them to do by the end of that module. Learners then work their way through that block of content, through that module, through that knowledge, and in order to demonstrate that they've mastered it. Where you use assessment and you identify gaps, that's where you spiral back, rather than at a later date, because that's the way you set your curriculum out. So when using a mastery curriculum, you're not looking to repeat it unless the gap emerges. And those students who don't achieve that level of mastery are aided by this as our cycle of teaching assessment. So the learning is class-paced rather than unit-paced. It's not defined by your 6-week term, it's defined by the needs of the class and the needs of the unit. Whole class work is carried out initially, then you use your first formative assessment, and then you fill in the gaps where needed. Now, one of the concerns about this type of curriculum is what you do with those students who either arrive at your school or in your class who already appear to have mastered a number of different elements. So what we do there is we use wider reading, we use depth of study, we develop breadth of study in order to challenge those students. And that, so far, is working fairly well. We began this process last September, and this is the second year of the process, though we've changed the English curriculum significantly since then. But this approach seems to conflict with some of the theories around forgetting and retrieval of information, retrieval of knowledge. And so I want to talk you through some of those different conflicting ideas. So it may sound like you never return to that content at all, but you do, and you do that through recaps, maybe a month later. You do a little bit of a quiz, multiple choice quiz, you use recapping at the beginning of your lessons, you interweave that information, because even if you're a Jedi, you need to be able to practice those skills in order to make sure that they don't slip. Equally, you can have someone who appears to have mastered someone previously, but who, as a result of the circumstances, need to return to some element of those skills. So Jess Ennis-Hill, for example, had a long period of time where she was off because she was on maternity leave, if you want to call it that as an elite athlete. She took that period of time out to look after her children, and has returned. One would assume that she's had to take different approaches to the ways in which she was originally training in order to remaster that content, to get back up to that level of an elite athlete. And our students need to do the same thing. Sometimes, Sam, for example, may have mastered or appear to have mastered something, then his tragic circumstances may have had an impact on what he appeared to have mastered previously, and you need to return to that. So your assessment needs to not only assess what's been taken in that module for that term, but needs to assess and interweave elements of the previous modules, so you can ensure that any slip or slide can be addressed. The third key issue is that sometimes we can appear to have mastered something, so we may have taken our driving test and have mastered driving because we've been given that validation by the examiner, but we then go on to unmaster it by developing bad habits. So we might have taken our exam, our driving exam, 1, 2, 3, or we might go over a number of different times, and then gone and unmastered all of the things, all of the good things that are put in place. A question that's often asked in staff rooms in schools is, how is it that my students appear to have done it in class, and then they've got to the test, they've got to the exam, they haven't got it, they've got to the final exam, they've forgotten it. Or, why can they do it in English or maths, but they can't do it elsewhere? And that's because you're moving to a different context. You're putting them in a different situation where that level of mastery disappears because of that different context. So, all of this has implications for our curriculum design and the way in which we've mapped out our curriculum. And to understand why those things happen, why that forgetting happens, and why that level of mastery disappears in other contexts, we talk to our staff, we talk to our teachers about two specific models of memory and the mind. Now, if you hadn't previously got out your Research Ed bingo card when I mentioned threshold concepts and when I mentioned mastery, now would be the time to get it out, because I'm going to talk now about Daniel Williams' model of the mind and memory in particular. And William Willingham identifies two key aspects of memory. One of those is long-term memory and the other is working memory. And if you haven't seen this before, essentially what Willingham says is that when we give students an input in the environment, when we're asking them to do something, when we're setting them a challenge, when we're setting them a problem of some kind, they need to have certain bits of information, certain bits of knowledge stored in their long-term memory that they can lift up into their working memory. And they also need to be able to have a working memory that can deal with both that problem and the status of that problem and pull up the information from long-term memory in order to be able to do that problem. Now, we all know that maths is clearly easier than English here. So the problem that I'm going to share with you is a multiplication problem. And the multiplication problem is 18 times 7. Now, if you know your 7 times table up to 12, normally you're okay. If you know it up to 18, here, you'd be able to tell me immediately that the answer is 126. If you don't know that, you've got to pull up various bits of information from your long-term memory to help you with this. 7 times 10, 7 times 8, and adding them together. And these are the steps that if you really don't know the answer to do that to that question, you need to go through to be able to come up with that answer. Now, if you imagine that on a much bigger scale, answering an analytical, providing an analytical response to a piece of poetry, the steps that you need to go through in order to be able to do that are far longer than the simple level of maths that's being done there. Willingham admits that his model of memory is a relatively basic one, a relatively simplistic one. So the model there is Alan Baddeley's, and his model involves a central executive, which is responsible for all of this. And within here, you have 3 sensory loops. One loop's responsible for your spatial and visual awareness. One is responsible for your auditory, and the other one is episodic. That's kind of what happens over a period of time, those moments in your life that you might need to pull back up into your memory. If you're dealing with metaphor, for example, that's really important because you might be able to make a link to your own experience. So he has these 3. He also has the processing of those from the environment. So the input that you give to students in class impacts on these 3 things. You use these 3 to deal with the information, and then it gets taken up to your central executive, which is a bit like the working memory that Willingham's model uses. Then you've got the long-term neural representations of networks. That's when these 3 things have been put together into your long-term memory. And then you've got this bit over here, which is information from your body, which is like, I'm really cold at the moment, or I can't wait till lunchtime because I'm starving. And that has an impact on how well you can respond to the problems that are being put in front of you. So what that has an impact on is the chances of you overloading your students' working memory by asking them something that's overly challenging because they don't have enough stored in here or in their long-term memory to be able to deal with the problem that you're putting in front of them. It also has an impact on your environment and making sure your classroom environment is pleasurable for them to be in and enables them to respond to you effectively, and potentially the kind of makeup of your school day, because if your school day isn't particularly useful in terms of their learning, it's not going to be it's not going to be as helpful to them in terms of their outcomes. And it also makes staff think about how they stage their curriculum, how they block that information, that knowledge and those threshold concepts into sequential steps so that students are able to work their way through the curriculum in an effective manner. The second model of the mind comes from Robert Bjork, and Robert Bjork talks about retrieval strength and storage strength. And I've ripped this from David's blog, but I've put in some examples of Year 11 situations. So you might have down here a piece of information that's low retrieval and low storage. And my example there is a bit of knowledge that you've imparted to your Year 11 set 5 minutes ago. Because you just moved immediately onto something else. It's difficult for them to retrieve because they're moving on to something else, and it's low storage because they haven't used it that many times. On the bottom right, you've got a piece of knowledge which Year 11 class have learned previously for the Year 6 SATs exam, so a long time ago, but they covered it a lot at that stage, but which they haven't had to use since. So you're asking them to draw something up into their working memory from a long time ago. So it's high storage, they knew it, and it's fixed there, but they haven't used it in a long time, so it's difficult for them to retrieve. Up in the top left, you've got a piece of knowledge which the Year 11 crammed 2 days before their exams. So they're really well able to retrieve it, because it's immediate in their memory, but it's not going to be stored for very long. And then the top right-hand corner, you've got something the teachers repeatedly tested them on over a number of years, not over a number of weeks or a couple of lessons, but over a number of years. And that's why it's important that you get your curriculum design right from Year 7, so that you're getting those students to use those procedures, use that knowledge again and again and again, so it becomes more fixed. And that means you've got to think really carefully about exactly which type of knowledge, which type of content knowledge, and which type of procedural knowledge you want to get your students to repeat and use again and again and again, so it does become more immediate and better stored. Paradoxically, and I think this links with what you were talking about earlier, if you ask students to continually use basic information and don't add more and add challenge and make situations in which they're being asked to retrieve that knowledge, there's less learning takes place, because they don't have to. You don't put them in situations where they're in a state of liminality. So the important thing is that you're constantly thinking about how you are asking students to retrieve the information you've set in front of them, and that you're putting them in difficult situations. And I think that also links to what Robert Coe talks about when he uses, as a proxy for learning, thinking hard about content knowledge. So out of those two models, out of the York model and out of the Willingham model, we've established some particular principles for curriculum design. So we say that we need to make sure the pitch of the factual knowledge and the pitch of the procedural knowledge that we're expecting students to use in our classes needs to be high and needs to be not easy. It needs to be difficult for them. We say that we need to space learning sessions on the same topic apart, rather than massing them together. So you're interweaving that knowledge and you're asking them to retrieve knowledge in a month, in a term, in 2 terms, in a year. We say that students needed to be tested on material rather than having them simply restudy it. And that's to do with their revision skills when they go back to their material at the end of each half term, when we have our termly exams. And we do assemblies on how to retrieve that knowledge, we do assemblies on how to revise effectively. Alongside those 2 models of memory, I mentioned earlier that we look carefully at our curriculum through the eyes of the trivium. And the trivium, if you're not aware of the work of Martin Robinson, is chunked into grammar, which is basically your knowledge of the subject, and dialectic, which is the students and your questioning of that knowledge, so putting students into that state of liminality. And then the third key area is about rhetoric. That's about their presentation of that knowledge either through speech or writing, generally in English. Though equally that applies to the presentation or production of a dance in this room, or the production of a product in design. So we do a number of different things. This is what we say in terms of that knowledge, that grammar element, and each of these areas we've attached to Teach Like a Champion strategies. And then for understanding again, we make sure that we're guiding students to new discoveries. We ask students how and why, prompt them to ask how and why they're doing certain things. And we expect students to devise questions of their own to get them to think about the topic, the content that's put in front of them. And in terms of the final area, that area of rhetoric, we coach students, we provide them with feedback on what they're doing. We open up new lines of questioning with them. make sure that whatever it was they produced, they could produce better the next time. One of the issues we're facing around this now is that students, when they get to year 11, don't have a next time, because they don't get to redraft that coursework anymore. They've got to be able to produce it right first time. We're calling our strategy there, and we're training them to produce the best quality work that they can in that 30 minutes, or whatever chunk of that exam they have, to do that work in. So what did we do in terms of our English curriculum? Well, we decided that it was really important to get, as it is in any school, the English curriculum right, but particularly, as we are at the moment, all working our way through redesigning Key Stage 4 curriculum, Key Stage 5 curriculum because of the new specifications, and Key Stage 3 curriculum in order to get students to be prepared for those different areas. So we enabled our English team to go off on a residential. And from that residential, we wanted them to have a vision for their teaching of English, to rethink what that vision might be if they needed to. We wanted them to set up some principles for assessment in English, specifically for year 7 to 9, but thinking about what that would look like beyond into Key Stage 4. We wanted to have a model of medium-term planning for English that would enable the English team to deliver all of the things I've just been talking about in terms of mastery. So in particular, so that the progress of students, the attainment of students wasn't passing, it wasn't fleeting, so that it was sustained, and it wasn't necessarily rapid and fleeting. And then we wanted them to produce some pilot medium-term plans for those 3 units. Before I carry on, I'll play a little poem. It fits in with what I've been talking about, but also what I'm going to go on to talk about. And this time it's The Thought Box by Ted Hughes.
I imagine this midnight moment's first. Something else is alive, beside the clock's loneliness, on this blank page where my fingers move. Through the window I see no star, something more near, though deeper within darkness, is entering the loneliness. Cold, delicately as the dark snow, a fox's nose touches twig, leaf. 2 eyes serve movement that now and again, now and now and now, sets neat prints into the snow between trees, and warily are laying shadow lights by stump and in hollow of a body that is bold to come across clearings, an eye, a widening, deepening greenness, brilliantly, concentratedly coming about its own business, till with a sudden sharp, hot stink of fox, it enters the dark hole of the head. The window is star still, the clock ticks, the page is printed.
Have you ever heard Hughes talk about how that poem came about? He talks about at university how each week he was expected to write an essay, and he was beginning to struggle with this. He had writer's block, and one night he stopped writing his essay because he got to the point where he couldn't carry on any longer. He started to head towards bed, and he imagined or saw this fox-like figure, this human fox-like figure, enter his room and go over to the blank page where he'd been writing, hold up his hand, which looked like it was burning, place it down on the page. And it was at that moment, Hughes says, that he realised he didn't want to study literature anymore, and he wanted to study anthropology. And what I don't want to do is turn our students off from poetry, clearly. What I do want to do is give our students, those students like Will and Sam and Ellie earlier on, opportunities to encounter brilliant literary texts. Now, when I was studying in sixth form, probably had a slightly higher interest in poetry than a number of our students. So I'd listened to Simon Armitage on Radio 1, he was on Radcliffe show. I fell in love with Ted Hughes' poetry at sixth form because he was the key poet that I studied in my first year of sixth form. On the flip side, I'm not wanting to put them off. I don't expect them all to fall in love with poetry in the same way as I did, but what I do want to do, and what our English team wants to do, is to expose them to the best poetry, novels, plays, non-fiction texts that are out there, so that they can be inspired, so they can have that moment where someone comes along and gives them that corporate moment on the page, and they're able to write far better than they were able to before. I don't want our students to be faced with writer's block. And with that in mind, on the residential, what we began to do was to think about what assessment might look like in English, what our curriculum might look like in English. And I don't know whether David mentioned this in the special concepts talk a moment ago, because I wasn't there unfortunately, but what he did, off the back of reading, I think a lot of your work, Ray, and other people's work, was he started to think about what the threshold concepts might be in English. And he defined, analysing text was one, using evidence was one, this is at secondary level, using context, thinking about context and understanding its influence on the writer and on the text that was produced. Awareness of having an impact, that awareness that when you put something down on the page, it has an impact on somebody else when they read it, but also that as a reader, you're aware that the writer is having an influence on you, they're impacting on you. The impact of structure and coherence as well as language, and then grammar, and the understanding that there are rules that we use in English and that we can use them to influence other people. Those are the ones that he did. Now, I can see people taking photos of that, and that's fine, but what we're currently in is in that liminal stage where we're now wondering whether these are right. Because I'm now, those aren't threshold concepts with some of them, but also some of them interweave. So that understanding of, that ability to analyse texts is informed by your ability to see where certain grammatical constructions have been used. And the understanding of the influence of context, well, it's difficult to understand the influence of context if you're not aware of how grammar was used at different points in time. So we're kind of at the stage now where we're thinking maybe this isn't right. So to take a photo of it and to go away and say this is what was said at Research Ed, I'm not sure those are all available on David's blog, so if you want to, you can use those and adapt them, and I think they're Word documents, so you can tweak them, which is what I think you should do. Also at the conference, David talked to us about how a lesson isn't necessarily the best unit of time in which to teach something. And in the same way that we used to block our terms and think about how we filled that term, now we're thinking about whether we should be teaching across a lesson, or whether we break the lesson down and say this part of the lesson we're focusing on this, and then that part is almost a different lesson. Or sometimes, actually we need 3 lessons to teach this. So we're not going to have a plenary at the end of the lesson where we pat ourselves on the back after it and say, yeah, the kids have got that, they've definitely got that. Actually, we know that they won't get it in that lesson, and we look at what they haven't got at the end of that first lesson rather than what they have. We don't turn around to our line manager and say, yeah, because we know that they're not going to get it for another 2 lessons. And the third thing that we were keeping in the back of our minds at the end of this residential was that we have something here at Swindon Academy called the personal best strategy, and it links to the exams which were mentioned earlier on by Ruth, that after that exam, we mark it, and then we rank order all of our students in a year group, in order for them to be able to see whether next time they can move up that rank ordering, or whether next time they can move up their marks, so that they get a sense of progress. And we found that that's been it hasn't been detrimental to the girls, but it's particularly useful for the boys who are really competitive. And the reason that we had that in the back of our minds was because we wanted to focus really closely on grammar and how we assessed that. And the way in which we were assessing it at the time was largely kind of isolated grammar tests, where if they could repunctuate a sentence that they knew was wrong, that showed us that they got that, but it doesn't show either that they've got that at all, because unless they can then take that and put it into this other context where they're applying it in a much longer piece of writing, that's not proven anything. So that ranking then became useful to us as a motivational tool, but actually we needed to think more clearly about how we were assessing those students in order to inform the learning that took place afterwards, rather than to inform the ranking. And it wasn't that that wasn't happening. It wasn't that our teachers weren't formatively assessing for our students, it was that we wanted to think through how that could happen far more smartly. Another key thing that we wanted to think about is this: what would you put in your English curriculum if there weren't any constraints? If Ofsted weren't going to come in and judge you on that curriculum, what would be your dream English curriculum? And then think, rather than think from, these are our constraints, this is what we've got to do, we're going to limit what we we do because of these constraints. What we wanted to do was to dream and then begin to think about what we needed to cut back on. And what we came up with was, at the time, something that looked a bit like this. We've gone for a chronological approach. So our Year 7s have nearly finished studying the Odyssey and Greek myths. And they moved through, they're about to study Oedipus. Then we're moving through to Beowulf and some ancient legends, onto rhetoric, and then onto language change in Chaucer. And they go all the way through to something that this is kind of changing in our minds at the moment in terms of preparing for GCSE a little bit more, but we're thinking about Martin Luther King speeches and rhetoric from the 20th century, freedom fighting, and then a kind of review of this curriculum we had in mind with something called class and character. Thinking about, in particular for our students, presentations of the white working class man, woman in the 19th and 20th centuries. We've changed some of that since, because we were mindful of the fact that if we took a chronological approach, our students were unlikely to see a novel until somewhere halfway through Year 8. And we didn't want that. And we were also mindful of the fact that initially this was going to be a rhetoric module where they did a little bit of Julius Caesar. And actually, as English teachers, we changed our minds. We want them to do more Shakespeare, so we're putting more into Year 7 and a little bit more into Year 8 as well. But essentially, those are going to tie in with the themes, the ideas of those modules. I'm going to flip on now to think about cars. The reason I want you to think about cars will become obvious in a moment. I want you to imagine that you've been sent to buy a car, but there are some restrictions placed on you. All of you will probably have some restrictions placed on you already. So, for example, I know that if I went off to buy a car, I'd need to have space for my 2 kids, their car seats. When we go away on holiday, there needs to be enough space for us to put all of the luggage, or the small amount of luggage space that I get, and a massive amount of space that the rest of my family seem to get. The shopping when you're coming on home, or everything you need from IKEA, whatever. Others of you in the audience might have a sort of very different view of the kind of car that you want to get. You might have this idea in your head that you're a bit of a James Bond figure. You get to the garage, and you can either choose the car as a result of whether it's got its MOT certificate or not, or you can take a test drive. Who'd take the MOT certificate? Why would you take the MOT certificate?
Because it was done when I was in credit.
Okay. Hands up if you take the test drive. Why would you take the test drive?
Because I love it, it's done when it's on different things and like different reasons.
Okay. Why would you take the test drive?
Not much the same way, really.
Yeah? Go on, why would you take a test drive?
To see if I fit.
Right. So the MOT gives you a certain amount of information. It tells you pretty much whether the headlights work, or whether the brakes work, or whether the tyre tread depth is the right depth, and therefore whether it's going to stay on the road. It tells you really whether the car's safe and legal. If you take the test drive, you find out a little bit more information. So you find out whether it fits your requirements, whether you fit in the car properly, whether if it's a Mini, it's not going to be a good move probably for you, Dom. But you find out whether it matches your requirements. And the reason why that's important is it helps us to think about different models of assessment in teaching. So one of the things that hit us this year is something that United Learning have introduced, and they've called it, and it sounds a bit business-like, they've called it Key Performance Indicators, or KPIs. And essentially what this does is it enables you, and these are the Year 7 KPIs, so up here we've got reading, understanding, independently select the information they need to support ideas and comments. So you could give a student an idea, you could give them a text, and you could ask them, can you find the information in this text that says that this idea is correct, or that supports this idea? Over here we've got some grammar, so can they accurately use the terminology of main clause, subordinate clause, interrogative sentences? Most of this is binary, it's yes or no. Can they identify a main clause in a sentence? Can they accurately use first person? Some of it is more subjective. So the first one I read out to you, it really depends on how challenging the text is. It depends on how challenging the idea or concept is that they're being able to find information to support. And it depends on the question that's been set. So for some of this, you require models to show at what level they should be able to model text, a model question, some model text, some model questions, and some model responses. For others, because it's quite binary in terms of assessment, it's quite easy to assess. This started to come out around January of last year for us. Our head of English, Krisha Hendra, who's meant to be here, unfortunately can't be today, in case you're expecting to see someone else on the side, that's why. She's on maternity leave, her little boy's not very well, so if I do mention she's going to say something later, it's not that I've got an imaginary friend, she's not here. This has hit both our assessment model and our curriculum model in some ways that we didn't expect it to. And what you can do with this sort of assessment is come up with something a bit like this. And what this does is it takes each of the KPIs that you cover in a term, and it red, amber, green, and blues them, so it suggests whether they've got a secure understanding, limited understanding, insecure understanding, or mastery understanding. We're saying that's 90%. And for each of the questions that they face in their exam, each of those is aligned with one of the, or more of the KPIs, and we give them a mark, and then it breaks down how many marks they've got, and then it tells you whether they've mastered it or not. And that's nice and pretty, but what actually it does is across a class or across a year group, it can identify for you which of those performance indicators that cohort, that individual is securing or has mastered. Or, probably more importantly, which ones they're insecure in and haven't mastered. And that means a head of department can set up interventions where they're necessary, but again, more important than that, well before that, the teacher can take responsibility for what's going on in the classroom and remodel their planning across the next term to make sure that by the next assessment point, more of those are green and blue, if not all of those are green and blue. There will be some students, like this one, who are secure already on making inferences at Year 7 level, using a model to assess that, and so need less time in class making that more secure than someone who would be read for that particular element. So it helps both in terms of assessment and tracking, but more importantly in terms of remodelling your teaching. This is quite a kind of MOT style form of assessment. It kind of sets out these are the things that we want students to be able to do to be safe to move on to Year 8 content, to be safe to move on to GCSE or A-level content. And what we wanted was something that kind of brings together that test drive approach and alongside this MOT style approach, because what we didn't want students to be doing was achieving some of these KPIs in situations where the rest of their writing is rubbish. And that has happened in some cases. One of the Year 8 KPIs is to do with the use of brackets. And another is, from this particular assessment, was secure and consistent use of third person, because the piece of writing they were asked to do was third person. Well, this student wrote a third person piece of writing, and they used some brackets a couple of times for parentheses effectively and securely, but the rest of their punctuation was all over the place and their spelling wasn't up to scratch. That's led us to understand more fully than we did before, and it wasn't that we weren't aware of this, it's just that we didn't see the implications for our assessment and curriculum, was that models are really, really important. And endpoints are really, really important, because we've done this, we've thought about the endpoint of wanting our students to be exposed to these brilliant texts, these beautifully crafted texts, across the chronology of English literature, since from the Odyssey onwards, thinking about the influence of Homer on modern writing. But what we hadn't really properly done is looked at the weighting of assessment and the constraints that are placed upon us when we get to Key Stage 4. And what we began to do was to unpick what the percentage weighting for different experiences is in the new specifications. So, if your students are taking language and literature, 12% of their time at Key Stage 4, if you do it mathematically in these tight constraints, should be spent on unseen literature fiction reading. and getting students to experience those types of questions that they're going to face in the examination. 12.5% should be spent on unseen non-fiction reading, thinking about points of view. And what we've started to do this year is think about how we can make sure our students in Year 8, Year 9 have enough experiences of answering the types of question that they'll face at GCSE level to be prepared to do that. And what we don't know is whether there's going to be a change in specifications again, but this is our best fit strategy at the moment to prepare our students for examination. And when you look at the types of questions STEM, and we're an AQA centre that they send out, I don't feel like those are unchallenging questions to set for Year 8, Year 9, Year 10 and 11 to prepare them for the world of GCSE. The other endpoint that we began to think about, what were the endpoints for the stages within a module? So what types of writing are our students going to have to do? What types of response to literature are they going to have to provide? So with each of our models now, our modules rather, we have the core knowledge, and that's laid out first, the things that students need to know. And then we think about the outcomes that are going to be generated. And we produce models of those to think through for ourselves what are the potential misconceptions that students might have, what are the potential things that might be barriers to them in producing their own piece of writing of this quality in terms of our expectations at this level. And between those two things, we think about the types of understanding that need to be developed in order for them to do that. But also the type of things that they don't understand currently based on our prior assessment of them. At that stage, we put on our KPIs that could be assessed, so that the KPIs aren't driving the curriculum like they were a while ago. And as we're reading through the texts, we're making notes about what the great extracts are. What are the key extracts that we want our students to be able to analyse, and also what the non-fiction extracts are that they're going to be analysing on top of those. But they're sometimes linked, because they're thematically linked, but sometimes not linked, because when they're doing GCSE, when they go into that exam, the non-fiction texts that they read aren't linked to the literature that they've studied. So we need to give them both of those experiences. Then we move down into a teaching sequence. We don't plan out individual lessons for our teachers. Instead, we think about the content that needs to be covered, and then we say, okay, that's going to take 4 lessons, or that's going to take 3.5 lessons, or that's going to take 3 lessons in 20 minutes. And think about how long that's likely to take for most classes, though obviously teachers can differentiate for their own class, because it's going to take slightly longer for them than it is for another class. And we provide teachers with all of that information for them to then think about how they differentiate. Now I hope that I have come across a little more humble than I used to. I hope I've given you an opportunity to think about your own curriculum, and I've given you a flavour of what we do here at this school. I think it's coming up to lunchtime now, so if anyone does want to ask any questions, I have to say, yeah.
Coming back to the theory around memory, do you have extensive self-training on that?
We read a lot, and then we didn't have, I wouldn't say we had extensive training on it, but we did when we set up Master Curriculum in the first place, we put aside one of our training days to it, and then we read back into it for every training session, pretty much every training session that we run. So we'll go back to, well, a long way back now. There are 7 key areas that make up our teaching and learning model, and we have a monthly CPD 2-hour session, and Monday's the next one of those. And each one of those would be aligned with one of the areas of this model. So on Monday we're looking at explanations and how we make sure that our explanations are as high quality as they can be. Because what we say is, it's fine for the teacher to talk here, as long as you've thought through the quality of that talk. And you can talk for 2 minutes and get a student to apply something, or it might require you to talk for 10 minutes, but that quality of that 2 minutes or that 10 minutes needs to be really high. Does that make sense? Yeah? Yes?
It's interesting, your MOT and test drive models. In our neck of the woods, we call those a high fidelity model or a low fidelity model. High fidelity models are very low on trust, but they're very good on consistency.
Yes.
So your sort of national
Yes.
requirements are high fidelity models.
Yeah.
And the MOT's like that, isn't it?
Yes.
It's very consistent, everything
Yeah.
gets that same way. In the test drive, right, our friend here, you could test what you wanted to some extent, could you? If you want to really accelerate this thing, so you echo drive bends and so on, it brings the elements of sort of innovation, variation, and it's a higher trust model. The high fidelity one is a low trust model.
It is.
And so that there's always a trade-off, isn't there?
Yeah.
High fidelity models are seen to actually stifle innovation, whereas low trust models, low fidelity models, encourage innovation, you get inconsistency in pockets.
I think that's why the models are so important.
Sort of trade.
And we're beginning to look at doing some work with an organisation called No Marking, which sounds really exciting because as a teacher, you know about No Marking. But what it looks at is comparative judgments. So, Chris Swindon doing work. He's on Twitter as at No Marking. And what they do is they get PhD students, I think, generally, to sit with a bank of essays. They were looking to get us to put them to Google Docs, but we're trying to get them to use scanning, so we scan essays in. And they put two essays up against each other, and they say that was better. Then they look at the next two essays, that one's kept, new one, that one's better. And they keep making those comparisons, and across a range of students doing that, across a range of markers doing that, the accuracy level of that becomes higher. So Dom could sit in 5 cars, and he'd quite easily be able to say, yeah, that one's more comfortable, that one's rubbish, not fitting that one, that one's faster. And you can make those comparisons much more accurately than you can with those descriptors, that criteria type marking. Comparative marking, research suggests, is more accurate than descriptor marking. Any more questions?
How do you then assessing it?
Pardon?
How do you then
Ranked assessments?
just rank?
Yeah. Oh, and what you can do is throw some models in. So this is our expectation for what a year 7 student can do, and this is our, and that becomes the level. And then the next year, if you've got some year 7 students who've done better than you were expecting, you would then use that to benchmark, so you're
How do you
continually
then apply
lifting
that to
expectations.
reporting or later on to the GCSE grades?
We'd use the KPI to report.
Right.
The KPI system is our reporting system to parents now, but internally, in terms of our expectations of students, we're constantly raising those. We can do that through that system too. Okay.
So, the KPI directly replaces the APPs?
We don't use APP anymore, we haven't used it for a few
That's
years.
kind of where you...
That's where it's where United Learning are moving to.
Could you use Kagan? So they don't have to do it every time.
We don't use Kagan models, no. I know other schools do. We become a teach like a champion school, really.
Some of the things are...
Yeah, they're just, what it provides you with is a vocabulary to discuss teaching with other teachers. I think both models do that. For us, the Teach Like a Champion felt like a better fit for the way we wanted to go in the UK. Okay, I'm aware it's lunchtime now, so I'm happy to speak to any of you afterwards or at lunchtime or whenever, end of the day. Thank you very much.